In the vast, silent heart of the American wilderness, some things are better left unfound. For one man and his dog, stationed in a lonely tower miles from civilization, the greatest terror is not the howl of the wolf or the shadow of the bear, but a presence that leaves no tracks in the dirt. It is an unseen predator that hunts not for flesh and bone, but for the one thing a living creature can't hide: its fear. This is a story about the silence that screams, the shadows that watch, and the primal dread of being hunted by something that isn't there. Let's begin the story. Get comfortable and listen closely. The world, from David Miller's perspective, was a sea of green and stone under an endless blue sky. His perch, the Black Ridge Lookout, was a 15 by 15-foot room of glass and steel bolted to the mountain's granite spine, an island in a vast, silent ocean of pine and fir. For a man who had spent 2 decades commanding chaos, the solitude was a balm. Down in the world of noise and people, he was David Miller, 42, medically retired from search and rescue. Up here, he was just a pair of eyes, his only duty to watch for the faintest curl of smoke. Beside him, Boone, a German shepherd whose muzzle had grayed and whose hips had stiffened, sighed in his sleep. The old dog was the other half of his retirement. They had been a unit, the best K9 team in the state, until a fall during a blizzard rescue shattered David's tibia and tore the ligaments in Boone's shoulder. The doctors had fixed David's leg, but Boone's explosive energy was gone, replaced by a noble, arthritic limp. The job, their life, had ended for both of them. So he took this post, a way to keep Boone in the wilderness he loved without the punishing demands of the trail. Here, their only job was to exist together, watching the world turn. David ran a hand over Boone's back, the coarse fur familiar and comforting. He adjusted the focus on the Osborne firefinder, sweeping the brass ring in a slow, practiced arc across the horizon, his gaze tracing the deep, shadowed canyons and sun-drenched peaks. The routine was his anchor. Wake, brew coffee, check the weather station, scan the forest, log it. Repeat. On the 3rd day of the season, the routine broke. Boone, who had been dozing peacefully at David's feet, suddenly lifted his head, a low whine vibrating in his chest. He pushed himself up, his movements stiff, and walked to the north-facing railing of the catwalk that encircled the cabin. His body went rigid. The fur along his spine bristled, and his tail, usually relaxed, was now a stiff, low-held exclamation point. He wasn't barking. He was staring. His gaze was fixed on a dense, unremarkable patch of Douglas firs about a mile distant. David came to his side, placing a hand on the dog's tense shoulders. "What is it, boy? See a bear?" He raised his binoculars to his eyes, scanning the area Boone was so intensely focused on. Nothing, just trees, rocks, and the gentle sway of branches in the afternoon breeze. There was no movement, no dark shape of a bear or the tawny flash of a cougar, yet Boone remained a statue of canine dread, his whine escalating slightly, a sound of deep, instinctual unease. David watched for a full 10 minutes before coaxing the old dog back inside, attributing the episode to a scent carried on a strange current of wind. Old dogs, like old men, had their quirks. Later that afternoon, as the sun began its slow descent, painting the sky in hues of orange and violet, David noticed the silence. It wasn't the usual quiet of the high country, which was always filled with the hum of insects, the distant chatter of a squirrel, or the cry of a hawk. This was a profound, unnatural hush, a dead spot, and it was emanating from the exact section of forest where Boone had been staring. He took off his headphones, straining his ears. Nothing. It was as if a vacuum had been placed over that patch of wilderness, sucking all the sound out of it. The lack of noise was more jarring than a gunshot. It felt fundamentally wrong, a violation of the natural order. He stood at the window, watching for nearly an hour. Then, as subtly as it had begun, the normal soundscape faded back in. A lone chickadee chirped, then another. The buzz of unseen insects resumed. The forest was alive again. David made a note in the official log. 1640, localized unexplained acoustic anomaly. All ambient wildlife sounds ceased for approx 55 minutes, Sector 4 Bravo. Weather clear, wind negligible. Cause unknown. He wrote it off as a strange trick of topography and air pressure, a plausible scientific explanation that did nothing to soothe the unease prickling at the back of his neck. 2 days passed in quiet normalcy. The sun rose and set. David made his scans, and Boone slept, the picture of a content old dog. The memory of the silent forest and Boone's strange behavior began to fade, filed away as a wilderness oddity. David was oiling a hinge on the cabin door when Boone shot up from his bed, not with a whine but with a panicked yelp. He scrambled backward, his claws scrabbling on the wood floor, and wedged himself under the small metal desk where David kept his logs. He was trembling violently, his eyes wide with a terror David had never seen in him, not even on the worst of their rescue calls. "Boone, what the hell?" David started toward him. He never made it. It hit him like a physical blow. A wave of pure, undiluted fear washed over him, so potent and so sudden it buckled his knees. It wasn't an emotion born from a thought. It was a foreign sensation injected directly into his nervous system. His heart hammered against his ribs, a frantic drumbeat of panic. A cold sweat drenched his skin. He felt a primal, horrifying certainty that he was being watched by a predator, the kind of dread a rabbit feels in the instant before the eagle strikes. There was no reason for it. The sky was clear. The forest was quiet. He was safe in his tower. But his body screamed otherwise. It screamed that death was imminent, that something ancient and unseeably vast was passing nearby, and its shadow alone was enough to short-circuit his mind. He gasped for air, his vision tunneling, the familiar cabin suddenly feeling like a fragile cage. The feeling lasted for a paralyzing minute, an eternity of ice-cold terror. And then, just as quickly as it came, it vanished. It left him shaky, disoriented, and breathing in ragged gulps, the adrenaline leaving a bitter, metallic taste in his mouth. He stumbled to the window, his hands unsteady as he braced himself against the glass. He looked out, his gaze drawn once again to that same patch of forest in Sector 4 Bravo. A herd of mule deer had been grazing peacefully in a meadow at the edge of the woods. Now they were frozen solid. Every one of them, from the big buck to the smallest fawn, was stock still, heads up, ears swiveled, all staring in the exact same direction. They were like a collection of statues, a taxidermist's grim diorama. They held the pose for what felt like a lifetime. Then, as if a spell had been broken, they exploded into motion, bolting in the opposite direction, their white tails flashing as they disappeared into the trees in a blind panic. His hands were still trembling when he keyed the microphone for his scheduled evening check-in. "Blackridge Lookout to base." "Go for base, David. All quiet up there?" Sarah Vance, a familiar grounding crackle, came back instantly. "Affirmative, Sarah. Mostly." He cleared his throat. Had some strange animal behavior to report. A whole herd of deer just went from 0 to 60 for no apparent reason, spooked by something fierce. Copy that, Black Ridge. Sarah's voice was practical, the voice of a supervisor who had heard it all. Probably a mountain lion moving through the area. They'll do that. Keeps the herds on their toes. You keep your eyes peeled. Will do, David said, his voice betraying a slight tremor. Black Ridge clear. He hung up the microphone. A mountain lion. The explanation made perfect logical sense. It accounted for the deer. It accounted for Boone's reaction. But it didn't account for the wave of dread. That was his. That had been inside his head. A terror that had no source and no name. And it felt nothing like the cautious respect he had for a physical predator. It felt like standing on the edge of a cliff in the dark, knowing something was about to push you. Sleep offered little respite. David was plagued by dreams of a silent, watching forest. The next morning, fueled by coffee and a desperate need for a logical explanation, he made a decision. He was going down there. He wasn't a man who tolerated mysteries in his backyard, especially not ones that terrified his dog and infected his own mind. He geared up. Sturdy boots, a small pack with water and a first aid kit, and a heavy sheath knife on his belt. He clipped the leash onto Boone's collar. The old dog knew. The moment they stepped out of the cabin and onto the tower's top stairs, Boone began to resist. He whined, a pleading, high-pitched sound, and dug his paws into the metal grating, pulling back toward the safety of the lookout. "Come on, boy," David urged, his voice firmer than he felt. "We're just going for a walk. We need to see what's got you so worked up." The hike down the winding trail was a battle of wills. Boone, normally eager for any excursion, lagged behind, his body tense, his nose constantly twitching as he sampled the air with a visible anxiety. It took them an hour to reach the area, the dead spot, where the silence had fallen, where the deer had frozen. It was a small, sun-dappled clearing, edged by towering firs and thick underbrush. And it was normal. Utterly, maddeningly normal. The ground was a soft carpet of pine needles and damp earth. Birds were singing in the canopy above. A squirrel chittered angrily at their intrusion. David, leveraging 2 decades of search and rescue tracking experience, began a methodical search. He walked in slow, overlapping circles, his eyes scanning for any sign of a large predator. He looked for the distinct, round tracks of a mountain lion, the heavier prints of a black bear, or the canine pattern of a wolf pack. He looked for scat, for torn-up ground where a large animal had rested. He found nothing. No broken branches, no matted-down grass where a large animal had rested. The ground was completely undisturbed save for the tracks of the deer herd from the day before. The lack of evidence was a scream in the quiet woods. A predator large enough to spook an entire herd of deer would leave a mark. It was a law of nature. Yet here, there was only pristine, untouched wilderness. The absence of a physical cause was more disturbing than any footprint could have been. As they stood in the center of the clearing, Boone whining and pressing against his leg, David experienced a new anomaly, a smell. It arrived on the still air, thick and cloying. It had no obvious source, yet it was everywhere, a bizarre and repulsive cocktail of scents. There was a sharp metallic tang of ozone, like the air after a lightning strike. Beneath that was a coppery smell, the scent of fresh blood or old pennies. And woven through it all was a faint but sickeningly sweet odor of decay. Something vaguely like rotting meat left too long in the sun. It was a scent that didn't belong in a healthy forest. Boone went frantic. He lifted his nose high, sniffing the air with a desperation that bordered on panic. Then he dropped his head and began digging furiously at the base of a huge, ancient pine tree, tearing at the roots and dirt as if trying to unearth the source of the vile odor. David grabbed his collar. "Boone, stop, heel!" He pulled the dog away, his own heart starting to pound. This wasn't right. None of this was right. He looked at the clawed-up earth, then at the silent, watching trees. A cold knot of dread tightened in his stomach. He was an expert at finding things that were lost. He was beginning to realize he was now faced with something that didn't want to be found, and it had left its scent here as a warning. Night fell on Black Ridge not as a blanket, but as a shroud. The setting sun did little to warm the chill that had settled deep in David's bones since his hike. He sat in the glass room, the encroaching darkness pressing in, turning the windows into black mirrors that reflected his own tense face. He kept Boone close, the dog's warm, solid presence a small comfort against the vast, empty wilderness. At 22:13, it came for him. It started with Boone. The dog, who had been lying under the table, shot to his feet with a ferocious, guttural bark that echoed in the small cabin. It wasn't his usual "someone's here" bark. This was a sound of violent alarm, a raw, primal challenge. He stood facing the trap door that led to the stairs, his body a rigid line of aggression, the hair on his back raised in a thick ridge. A moment later, the wave of terror hit David. It was exponentially stronger than before, a psychic tsunami that slammed into him with physical force. His breath hitched, his vision swam. A crushing, absolute certainty flooded his mind. You are going to die. Here. Now. He felt a presence, an intelligence, focused entirely on him. It was no longer a passing shadow in the forest. It was at his door. Then came the sounds. With the all-consuming fear came auditory hallucinations, or what he desperately tried to tell himself were hallucinations. Faint, impossible noises from just outside the glass walls, 100 feet above the ground. The soft, wet sound of heavy breathing, a rhythmic, guttural exhalation that seemed to vibrate in the metal frame of the tower. A gentle dragging noise on the exterior catwalk, like a heavy sodden sack being pulled along the grated metal. And whispers. The whispers were the worst. They weren't words, not yet. But they sounded like a radio tuned between stations, a chorus of sibilant static that scraped at the edge of his hearing, promising language but delivering only menace. He knew, with a certainty that defied all logic, that he was surrounded. He was on a metal tower with a single steep staircase. Nothing could get up here without him hearing its heavy climb, step by step. Yet it was here. He scrambled away from the windows, pulling Boone with him into the corner of the room farthest from the door. He huddled on the floor, wrapping his arms around his trembling dog, burying his face in the animal's fur. "It's okay, boy. It's okay," he whispered. The words a lie meant to comfort himself as much as the dog. They stayed like that, two terrified creatures riding out a storm of pure dread while the impossible sounds of breathing and dragging continued just outside. The siege on his senses lasted for what felt like hours. Finally, as the first hint of gray light began to dilute the oppressive black of the night, the terror began to recede. The sounds faded, the feeling of imminent death draining away, leaving him hollowed out, exhausted, and raw. He didn't move until the sun was fully risen, casting long shadows across the cabin floor. Slowly, cautiously, he crept to the window and peered out. The world was calm, beautiful, and utterly indifferent to his night of terror. His rational mind screamed at him that it was a panic attack, a hallucination brought on by isolation. But his gut knew better. With Boone sticking close to his heels, he unbolted the trapdoor and descended the stairs. He circled the base of the tower, his eyes scanning the ground. As he expected, there were no footprints, no tracks of any kind in the soft dirt. Then he looked up at the steel legs of the tower. His blood ran cold. Starting from the ground and running all the way up to the catwalk outside his room, 100 feet in the air, were long, deep, parallel scratches gouged into the thick metal. They were stark and raw against the tower's weathered paint. 3 parallel lines running vertically up the steel supports. It looked as if a giant and possibly heavy creature with claws of industrial steel had simply clawed its way up the side of the tower, leaving its signature in the very bones of his refuge. There were no tracks at the base. There was no physical logic. There were only the scratches and the terrifying memory of the fear. "Sarah, it was here. It came up the tower." David's voice was a ragged edge of panic over the radio, the morning sun doing nothing to dispel the previous night's horror. He described everything, the sounds, the overwhelming dread, and the scratches. He could almost feel her bewildered silence over the crackling airwaves. "Scratches? David, what could do that? A bear?" she asked, but her voice lacked its usual conviction. "No bear on earth, Sarah. They start at the ground and go 100 feet up. There were no prints, nothing. It's like a ghost with claws climbed the tower." His terror was a raw, open thing, transmitted across the miles. For the first time since he'd known her, Sarah Vance was at a loss for a logical explanation. "Okay, David. Okay. Stay calm," she said, her tone shifting from supervisory to genuinely concerned. I don't know what to tell you, but I'll check the archives, see if there are any unofficial reports, anything from that sector. I'll get back to you." The radio went silent, leaving David alone with his thoughts in the glass cage, trapped and isolated, with the evidence of the impossible gouged into the metal beneath him. His mind raced, desperately trying to connect the pieces. The silent forest, the wave of dread, the frozen animals, the foul, unearthly smell, the sounds in the night, the scratches without footprints. It wasn't a physical creature, not in the way he understood one. A mountain lion hunts to eat. A bear attacks to defend. They are driven by biology. This was different. Its primary weapon wasn't tooth or claw. It was fear itself. It was a predator, but it didn't hunt flesh. It hunted with fear. It was a fear eater. The name formed in his mind, stark and terrible. It leaves no footprints because its physical interaction with the world is minimal, perhaps existing on a slightly different plane of reality. The deep scratches weren't the marks of claws in a conventional sense. They were a side effect, a physical discharge of immense energy, like the scorch mark left by a lightning strike. It had come to his tower because he was a potent, focused source of the very thing it craved. Hours later, Sarah's voice crackled back over the radio, sounding strained. "David, are you there?" "I'm here," he said, his voice flat. "The official records are clean, nothing. But I dug deep, found the box of old, unofficial station logs from the 50s, written by hand. The ramblings of a long-retired ranger named Alistair Finch, who worked Black Ridge." She paused, "but there's one entry, his last one before he requested a transfer. I'll read it to you verbatim. It is real. I do not know what it is, but it is real. It leaves no tracks, only a coldness in the soul. I have come to believe that whatever is on this mountain, it feeds on fear. The more you're afraid, the stronger it gets, the closer it comes. Do not feed the shadow." The old ranger's words hung in the air, a 50-year-old echo confirming David's theory. He looked out at the silent, beautiful forest, no longer a sanctuary, but a hunting ground. He wasn't just being haunted, he was being farmed.
The knowledge changed everything. The entity was no longer a random, terrifying phenomenon. It was an intelligent predator, and David was its sole, captive food source. It learned. Now that it had a focused, highly reactive mind to prey on, it became a constant, insidious presence around the tower. The attacks grew more sophisticated, more personal. It stopped being a blunt instrument of terror and became a surgeon of the psyche. It discovered that David, a man trained to listen for the snap of a twig or a distant cry for help, was acutely sensitive to sound. The whispers outside the glass evolved. They were no longer just static. Sometimes they would mimic the crackle of a rescue radio, a faint, desperate voice calling for help from the woods below, preying on his old instincts. Other times, and far worse, the whispers would coalesce into the sound of Sarah's voice, distorted and full of static, whispering his name in the dead of night. "David, I'm lost. Help me." It was a cruel, calculated torment. The entity also knew he trusted his dog above all else, so it began to attack that bond. One evening, as David was charting weather patterns, he heard a low, menacing growl from the corner of the room. He turned and saw Boone, his lip curled back, teeth bared, staring directly at him. A chill of betrayal and fear shot through David, but before he could react, he glanced at the real Boone, who was lying peacefully by his feet, head cocked, looking at the same empty corner with a confused expression. The growling apparition flickered and vanished. It was a projection, a hallucination designed to make him doubt his only ally. In that moment, David made a critical realization. He had to stop trusting his own senses. His eyes and ears were now liabilities, open channels that the entity could hijack at will. The only reliable sensor he had was Boone. The old dog didn't react to the false sounds or phantom images. He only reacted to the true presence of the entity, the invisible pressure wave that his primal instincts could detect. Boone became his anchor to reality. When Boone was calm, David forced himself to ignore the whispers. When Boone's fur bristled and he stared at an empty point in space, David knew the predator was near. He learned to navigate his world not by what he saw or heard, but by the subtle cues of his arthritic, faithful dog. The radio crackled to life late one afternoon, and this time the voice was the real Sarah, her tone urgent and sharp. "David, big weather alert. A major unseasonable electrical storm system just popped up, and it's heading directly for your mountain. It's going to be severe. Standard procedures to evacuate the tower during intense lightning. The metal acts as a giant lightning rod. You need to come down." David looked out the window. The sky to the west was a bruised, menacing purple. He then looked at Boone, who was already on his feet, whining and pacing, staring not at the approaching storm, but at the stairs leading down. The entity was outside. It was waiting for him. He understood with sickening clarity. This was its chance. The storm's raw, chaotic energy combined with the heightened terror of being trapped in a lightning storm would be a feast. It might be enough for the creature to fully manifest, to break through whatever veil separated their worlds. He couldn't leave, the entity was waiting below. He couldn't stay, the storm would turn his refuge into a death trap. He was trapped for the storm. He keyed the mic, his voice grim. "Negative base, I can't evacuate. I'm staying put." The storm hit the mountain like a fist. Wind howled, a physical scream against the glass, making the entire tower groan and sway. Rain came not in drops, but in horizontal sheets that blurred the world into a churning gray chaos. And the lightning? It was terrifyingly close, brilliant white forks that ripped the sky apart, followed instantly by concussive blasts of thunder that vibrated through the floor and into David's teeth. The entity used the storm as its cloak. The wave of fear returned, a constant, crippling pressure that suffocated his thoughts. The whispers were now a roar, indistinguishable from the wind. Through the rain-streaked glass, in the strobing flashes of lightning, he could see it. On the catwalk, a shimmering, static-like distortion was coalescing. It was vaguely humanoid in shape, but its form was unstable, constantly shifting and writhing like a heat haze off astrophalt. Its heavy, wet breathing was now a tangible sound, a horrifying counterpoint to the thunder. It was trying to break him, to push his mind into a state of pure, mindless terror so it could feed. David scrambled to the center of the room, pulling Boone down with him. The dog was a shivering wreck, but he stayed pressed against David's side. The words of the old ranger echoed in his head. The more you're afraid, the stronger it gets. Do not feed the shadow. He couldn't fight it with force. He couldn't run from it. His only weapon was his own mind. He had to starve it. The climax was not a battle of fists, but a war of will. David closed his eyes, ignoring the storm, ignoring the shimmering apparition on the catwalk, ignoring the thunderous breathing. He shut out the terror by focusing his entire being on the one thing in the universe that was pure and real, his dog. He wrapped his arms around Boone's thick neck, burying his face in his fur, and he began to talk. "Hey, boy," he whispered, his voice calm and steady, a deliberate act of rebellion against the chaos. "Remember that time on Mount Rainier? The lost hikers? You found that little girl's mitten, and you led us straight to them. You were so proud, Boone. The best boy." A flash of lightning lit the room, revealing the static form pressing against the glass. The wave of fear intensified. David squeezed his eyes tighter, focusing inward. "Remember the summers at the lake? Chasing that red ball until you couldn't stand? Lying on the dock in the sun? Remember that feeling, buddy? The warm sun." He poured every ounce of his concentration into the memories, focusing on the feelings they evoked: love, loyalty, pride, courage, warmth. He was actively overriding the psychic assault with a barrage of positive, powerful emotions. He was offering the fear eater a meal it couldn't stomach. The entity, faced with this inedible emotional state, seemed to react with confusion, then rage. The pressure on David's mind became a physical force, a deafening, psychic screech that promised to tear his sanity apart. A bolt of lightning struck the tower's communications array with a sound like the world splitting in two. The lights went out. The air filled with the smell of ozone, and the tower shook violently. In that moment of absolute sensory overload, David clung to Boone and spoke of their first day together, a scared puppy in a cardboard box. He held that memory, that feeling of nascent, unconditional love, like a shield. And then, as he continued his calm monologue, as the eye of the storm passed directly over the peak, the presence began to recede. The psychic scream faded to a whine, then to silence. The pressure vanished. The static form on the catwalk dissolved. Its power broken, its influence faded with the passing of the storm's fury. Dawn broke clear and cold. The storm had scrubbed the air clean, and the world outside the glass walls was pristine and silent. It was a true silence this time, peaceful and natural, filled with the gentle dripping of water from the tower's frame. The presence was utterly gone. David could feel its absence in his very bones. He and Boone were exhausted, bruised, and soaked from rain that had forced its way through the window seals. But they were alive. He found the emergency hand crank radio and, after several minutes of effort, managed to get a signal. "Black Ridge Lookout to base." Sarah's voice came through, thick with static and relief. "David, my God, we thought the tower took a direct hit. Are you okay?" "We're okay, Sarah," David said, his voice steady and calm. He didn't explain what really happened. He couldn't. "The strike knocked out our main power and comms, but the tower's structurally sound. We're okay." "Thank God," she breathed. "Just stay put. We'll—" "Sarah," David interrupted gently, "I'm requesting an immediate evacuation from my post, citing the lightning strike and a compromised mental state due to extreme isolation." It was the only explanation they would accept, a partial truth that hid the impossible whole. A helicopter arrived by noon. As he packed his few belongings, David took one last look from the catwalk. The forest was just a forest again, beautiful, wild, immense. But he now knew that within its beauty lay secrets, ancient and hungry. He left with Boone at his side, leaving behind the scratches on the tower leg as the only testament to his war. Months later, David was living a quiet life in a small town nestled in the foothills far from the high peaks. He volunteered at the local animal shelter, the simple company of the dogs a quiet therapy. Boone, older and slower than ever, was his constant shadow. One evening, as dusk settled, they were walking in a local park. The air was cool, the sounds were of distant traffic and children playing. A stray dog, tied to a bench at the edge of the park, suddenly began barking frantically, a high, panicked sound directed at an empty spot under a large oak tree. David felt a faint phantom chill on his skin. Boone stopped dead in the middle of the path. His fur, just along his spine, rose slightly. He let out a low, soft whine, his gaze fixed on the same empty spot the other dog was barking at. David froze, his breath catching in his throat. He looked at the empty space, at the deep shadows gathering under the tree, and he felt the ghost of that familiar, primal dread. It wasn't here for him. It wasn't strong. It was just hunting. He placed a reassuring hand on Boone's back, the steadying touch as much for him as for the dog. "Come on, boy," he whispered, his voice perfectly calm. They turned and walked the other way, leaving the barking dog and the patch of shadow behind. He hadn't defeated it. He understood that now. You can't kill a thing that feeds on fear. You just learn to recognize its hunting grounds, and you learn to never, ever walk there.